Let's call this meeting to order. The subject, of course, is Uber, a technology company, communication company. Let's do a identification around the table with the members that are here. Julia, we'll start with you, ma'am.
Thank you. Julia Tucker, Assembly Council.
Pete Peterson, Assembly. Ernie Hall.
Amy DeBoski.
Bill Evans.
Tim Steele.
Dick Train.
Melody Gray Jackson.
Dennis Bear, Split Attorney.
Kamala Weiss, Assistant Municipal Attorney.
Okay, just so people know where we're going, we're going to do some time over to Dennis Wheeler first, our city attorney. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I handed the Assembly an envelope, if you will, or a folder with some documents in there that I'm going to refer to. I handed one to representatives of Uber and one to Mr. Brennan for the taxi entities. There's a few extras up there at the back table for anyone else who wants them. There's a very simple table of contents at the beginning of the folder. What I wanted to try to do was take a few minutes to sort of issue spot based on what I'm seeing in litigation from other jurisdictions, in the news stories about how city councils or states have addressed the issue. I've included some model regulations from the International Association of Transportation Regulators, and there's some basic information on the state of California, which seems to be a hotbed, birthplace and hotbed for TNCs. And then two more recent ordinances from other cities. There's, of course, a lot of different cities that have passed a bunch of different ordinances. These are relatively current, and they can help you, I guess, issue spot or see how the jurisdictions have written text to match up with whatever the concern is. So if you turn to the first document, it's a one-pager called Key Area of Concerns. Not in any particular order, except that I tried to organize them by perhaps what customers might be concerned about. The first one is whether or not these services may or may not discriminate against people seeking a ride. There's some litigation filed by a blind association regarding service animals. There's been some concern about whether or not these services should or should not provide wheelchair accessibility. I know there's been some trends where maybe they're required to do it, maybe there's a fee associated with improving the availability of those. So I'm sure that the technology companies can speak to what they're doing in various different jurisdictions as of today. And of course, the taxi side being heavily regulated, they cannot deny service. So there's some comparison points there. Number two, the fare and service transparency. One of the issues is surge pricing or other ways for the fares to jump during peak service times. If that's allowed, under what criteria? Is it always clearly displayed to the user when they seek a ride that that's going to be the circumstance that they find themselves in? There have been some complaints about outrageous billing, whether that's true or not true. Again, that's something that the companies can address, but something to be thinking about in terms of price structure. Some jurisdictions have responded to this by providing some regulation, including allowing the taxi industry to also have some fare flexibility. Not so much in whether you receive a curbside hail. That's generally, as I understand it, still heavily regulated on price. But if you use an application to acquire a taxi or a TNC ride, there may be some flexibility in pricing to address peak hours, peak service. And of course, one that's currently going on is litigation over the tip. There's a class action lawsuit involving whether or not the drivers are getting the full recompense on the tips that they should otherwise be getting, or allegedly should otherwise be getting. So customers have complained about that. Then alcohol and drug testing, what should those requirements be? Who provides the testing? Does that company provide it to the same standard that we provide, or is it a better standard? How should that look? What happens if there's a positive test? Is there post-accident testing? That sort of thing. Background checks. It seems to me that the state of California has pushed pretty hard to have extensive background checks in terms of the number of years look back, 70 years. There were some letters sent to the TNCs by the LA and San Francisco District Attorney's Office regarding background checks and how those are the fall that those are being marketed. There's supposed to be some kind of a meeting early this month. I don't know the outcome of that meeting and what the parameters of that were. That's an issue. Insurance may be a particularly complicated but important issue. Typically, your personal vehicle insurance does not cover you if you are operating that vehicle in a commercial capacity. If you are going to take your personal vehicle and become a driver, you need to acquire additional insurance. When does it kick in? Does the TNC's insurance cover you as a passenger, as a driver, as a third-party pedestrian or a third-party vehicle? What levels of insurance should there be? When does that insurance kick in? How are claims resolved? So that's a big area of discussion, and it's pretty complicated. As you may know, the State Division of Insurance issued a letter here not too long ago warning drivers about insurance coverage, and that they need to look at that very closely to see whether they have or don't have coverage. And then the taxi drivers and the associations that they're involved with have raised a number of issues regarding whether or not they're receiving protection or substitute due process under the law. That's something that needs to be considered. And I wrote down a few other considerations that may not be quite as significant, but should be discussed. Some places have imposed hours of operation for these drivers for safety reasons. There are questions about the level and quality of vehicle inspections. What do they inspect? Who pulls them out of service? And how do they get back into service? Driver training, and then economic side effects. There's some conversation about a flood of drivers, whether there then is a sort of a shrinking of drivers as none of them can necessarily make the kind of money they were hoping to make. Does that impact service levels? What does that do to the taxi industry? What service levels do they see in terms of whether drops or increases? So that's something that people are watching. So that's sort of an overview of key areas of concern. The next thing I provided for you is a table. The table attempts to get more into these key areas of concerns and show you what our code currently requires of, well, combined it's calling the taxi industry, and then what we understand Uber specifically and TNCs generally to offer. And there may be some variations from company to company, but this is based on information here out of news stories, pleadings, Uber's website information, and so on. We could, in theory, walk through this, but I don't want to necessarily get too much time on that.
Yes, I want you to go through your stuff first. I'm going to turn over to some members for questions.
Okay.
And move on to TNCs and move to taxis. I want to talk about where we're going.
Sure. All right, so the first one, the background checks, and T.I. Musser is here. I should come up in case there's questions.
Eric, identify yourself for the record. Thank you, sir.
So on background checks, the TNCs generally advertise that their background checks are better than many of the local jurisdictions do on taxi drivers. That may or may not be true. One of the things that you should note on both sides is that background checks may or may not get to the level of detail you might be thinking they do, whether it's for the taxi industry or for the TNCs. So you'll want to look at that. To the extent that we have imposed these background checks on drivers, you'll see a number of items that would disqualify someone for a chauffeur's license, and they're on the first page here, and I carry over to the second page. Recent convictions for moving violations, felony and misdemeanor convictions within the past 5 years for illicit offenses, and so on. And some of the Uber screening is actually, at least the way it's listed, more rigorous. So you'll want to know really who does the background checks, what databases are they hitting, how do those background checks compare to, say, for example, a background check that might be done for a public safety officer. My guess is they're probably not quite as rigorous both at the taxi driver level and at the commercial operator level, but we need to understand or find out more about how that works. there are a number of third-party companies that provide this service, so you can look at how they're rated and what their performance record is. On the second page, in the middle, we talk about restrictions on drivers, including whether a driver is under the influence of any kind of drug or alcohol, whether they can purchase or solicit the purchase in conformance with their duties or performance of their duties, post-accident testing, and so on. I don't know exactly what TNCs have for policies on those three items. That's why it's blank there. At the bottom, we had some information on scheduling. Some jurisdictions limit the number of hours. Some are, I think, pretty close to what we have for taxis, the 12 consecutive hours, 16 in a 24-hour period. Then, going to the third page, we talk about the ability to suspend transportation for public safety reasons. If the TNCs have policies in place for suspending drivers or pulling vehicles out of service, you'll want to know what those parameters are. If you want to make a decision about, in any of these areas, actually, whether or not you want to layer that with some level of regulation, set the whatever minimum standards you think would be appropriate for that. And the insurance requirements we talked about. We talked a little bit about the duties of the public, which is on page 4. We talked a little bit about the fares, how you set the fares, whether you want to make changes to them. If you look, then on page 5, we talked about vehicle inspections, both in terms of frequency and what they look at. If you look at ours, they typically give a little bit more description than what you see on the Uber side, but the Uber inspection form doesn't necessarily give the whole story. So you'll want to know for these TNCs, if they say they're inspecting doors, what are they looking for? When we look at our doors, we're looking at the hinges and latches being in good working order. Presumably, when Uber inspectors look at the doors, they're doing the same thing. But again, that's a question you'll want to ask and get some information on, as an example. That goes over a couple of pages to page 6 and 7. Some jurisdictions have talked about whether or not these TNC vehicles need to be marked in some manner. My assumption is that's designed to assist the passenger in recognizing that's the vehicle that's there for their pickup. So they don't, in some form or fashion, get into a vehicle that isn't actually offering them a ride necessarily. It'd be interesting to hear why jurisdictions go that route, because typically when you think about, say, a black car service, they're not necessarily marked in any outstanding way. And at least one TNC company has marked their vehicles with a pink mustache, I think. It's Lyft that does that, so they kind of stand out. So maybe there's some conversation about marketing. Number of vehicles available, whether there should be incentives in that regard. Record keeping. Some jurisdictions may have the TNC report to the TI on a regular basis. Other jurisdictions require the TNCs to maintain records, for example, on driver background checks, on vehicle inspections, and that sort of thing. So the TI can, on some routine or random basis, inspect records, ensure compliance. So that's another area of interest. Then under miscellaneous rules, one of the things that there's been some debate on is whether this is truly a different service or just a better service that has different bells and whistles on it. Some of the attorneys in the industry have indicated that to them it's the same essential service. It's A to B, pay for the service. If you want to start to distinguish them, then one, maybe the only essential difference is whether or not you provide curbside hailing. And if you look at the California material, which is called the Basic Information for Transportation Network Services, this is a document they put out if you want to get a TNC license. They the page. Oh, if you go to page 5, put little brackets around it. From the California Public Utilities Commission's perspective, there's only 2 distinguishing features. One is the licensing, and 2 is what they call the most important operational difference is the prearranged service versus being able to curbside hail. Is that by itself enough to consider these two services dramatically different? If so, then maybe your regulatory oversight needs to address that issue and how you level the playing field in other respects for prearranged rides, since both industries can now provide online application scheduling or dispatching, if you will. Do you treat the taxi service different because they're allowed to do curbside hail? And if so, do you maintain their pricing for that? Is there regulated pricing? But allow flexibility in pricing in other areas for taxi? That's one thing that some jurisdictions have done to address this issue about what's a level playing field. I tried to, in the city of Columbus and the city of Austin ordinances, well, I did in the city of Columbus, I didn't have time on Austin, to kind of bracket some things where some of the issues we talked about, record keeping, licensing, that sort of thing, to help you draw your eye to those questions so you can see how they did it. The city of Austin just passed this today, 17th? Last night, so I haven't had a chance to really digest this one, but I understand it's pretty similar to what was done in Houston. That's a really fast overview, Mr.
Thank you,
Trainer.
Dennis. I'm going to open up to assembly questions. Does members have questions for Mr. Weider? Assembly have no questions?
I have one.
Yes, Mr. Browski.
Mr. Wheeler, has the Department of Law or the administration actually sat down and talked to the representatives of Uber to try to understand some of these concerns that you highlighted you didn't have answers to? Or was the extent, just as you said, online research?
We had meetings before the litigation was filed. I met with them once, I know the mayor met with them once, to talk about whether or not they were regulated. We came back with a cease and desist letter to advise them they were regulated. They were already providing service. We filed the litigation. We've had a communication wherein they expressed an interest in following the City of Detroit model, which is to enter into an MOU. I think all of you may have seen that MOU before. I think it was used as an outline to help craft Mr. Trainey's ordinance. But everything's been going so fast, no, we haven't sat down to talk about these concerns in particular yet.
Okay.
Any other questions from assembly members? We'll move on to TNCs. Thank you, Dennis. Who's here from a TNC company?
Hi, Assemblyman Trainee Jennifer Alexander with Birchport and Bittner and Shrow, and I have brought Bryce Brennan from Uber.
Why don't you go up the table? I'll give you 10 minutes.
Gladly. No, Bryce.
And we'll keep the 10 minutes plus questions from the assembly. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Bryce Bennett from Uber here in the Northwest. We're encouraged to see the Assembly take such a proactive stance in welcoming new job-creating technologies, such as ride-sharing in Anchorage. Our ultimate goal is to provide the safest and most reliable ride to the thousands of people in this area. We have thousands of people opening up our app every day, begging for a ride right now. We're simply growing the size of the transportation pie, providing more choices for both riders and drivers alike. Ridership across the board is increasing as Uber is pushing the mentality that people don't necessarily need to get behind the wheel of their car to get around the city anymore. In Anchorage, as well as in all U.S. markets, Uber driver partner applicants are screened by criminal background checks, what a company called HIREs. Further, all vehicles undergo a 19-point inspection at either, here in Anchorage, a local MIDAS or MIDA key. Only after passing the background check and having their vehicle inspected will they be allowed to have access to the Uber platform. In addition, Uber will continue to provide the $1 million of liability insurance during the time a trip is taking place. We've reached out countless times to the city attorney and have shared with them examples of how other jurisdictions have approached this issue, both temporary and long-term. I'm here today to tell you that we look forward to working with the newly formed subcommittee and the city, just like we're doing in every other market that we're in. Our goal from the beginning has and always will be to provide safe, reliable transportation options for the citizens of Anchorage. And I'd like to say my team and I are happy to continue to be a resource to all of you to share either examples, ordinances, or, as in today, answer any outstanding questions or areas of concern. So I appreciate your time and allowing us to step in on your meeting here. So.
Thank you. Mr. Hall first, sir.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, nationwide, what percentage of requests were you able to accommodate?
We are typically around the 85 to 90% range in mature cities. So that's maybe not where we're at in Anchorage right now, but as the city grows and more drivers are able to access the system, we complete around that area. It depends on each city, but that's a ballpark.
Mr. Hall, anything else, sir? Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello. How many cities do you operate in?
215 globally.
Okay, this question may not be reasonable, but
there's a recent, earlier this year at $18 billion.
18 million?
Billion.
Billion? 18 billion? Billion. Okay, thank you. I'm not quite that much yet.
Questions from other Assembly members? Yes, Mr. Brodsky.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett, you had indicated some of the concerns I'm hearing is about insurance specifically and being gaps in insurance or, if a driver basically logs in and then he's on the system but he hasn't picked up a ride yet, and then I'm hearing there's a gap between the time he accepts the ride and he picks somebody up. Can you explain to me exactly what Uber's policies do? You mentioned this $1 million policy, but I'm hearing that there's a secondary policy too.
Yeah, and I can dive into it. It is an insurance that's maybe not like traditional insurance that a lot of people are used to. So there's really I'll explain it this way, and I think we have a one-sheet that I will make sure everyone gets as well on this, but there are 3 phases to our insurance policy. There's obviously times when people are not on the application at all. They're not logged in, they're on their personal insurance that they would use every day. There's the time then when someone would say in the app going online to be available to accept requests. At that point, they're not on a trip, they're just available on our system. At that point, their primary is still personal insurance, but we provide a contingent secondary policy, which is outlined, I believe, in a couple different documents that have been passed around here. And then it's at that point when the rider, or driver, I should say, actually accepts the request on their phone when that comes in, that the $1 million liability insurance kicks in from the time that they travel to the rider, pick them up, to the time that they end the trip. And then they revert back to the in-between stage there.
I'll have another one in just a minute. I need to think about it.
Ma'am, do you want me to move on? Or do
No,
you-
I got it.
Okay.
I remembered it. So the second question is highlighting the very top of Mr. Wheeler's concerns was service to the disability community and the potential for discrimination, as he's titled it. Can you comment to me about experiences or what Uber is doing maybe nationwide or what you have found? Is this a realistic concern?
I'm happy to address that. Depending on the city, we are rolling out multiple options for the disabled and handicapped. In Philadelphia, in California, we're working on this as well. But that's definitely a priority of ours. And in Seattle, where I'm currently at, we have a very good relationship with the blind community. Actually, they use the service quite a bit and find that they can really make a good relationship with a lot of different drivers that understand and are able to really approach that delicate situation when it comes to, of course, requesting a ride. And so the nice thing about the system in this case that you do see who your driver is, you see when they're going to be there, so you have that visibility. Or not, maybe if you were disabled or handicapped in any way, that you wouldn't be waiting out on the street looking for your vehicle. Potentially, you know exactly when they will be there, and you have a direct contact with them. It provides a lot of accountability that way. and for a lot of the people that I have spoken with in that community, a sense of accountability and security. So.
And so, just to follow up, one of the comments Mr. Wheeler had made was, you don't necessarily know, you requested a car, but what your car is. But my understanding from the app, and I've never used your service, but my understanding from the app is, when somebody's accepting a ride, they get to see who the driver is, what the car looks like, they can see reviews. So can you describe that for us as
Absolutely.
a layperson? Am I going to accidentally get in Joe's car when I actually want to get in Jane's?
No, absolutely. So so you'll open up. I'll go through kind of the whole process, start to finish. So you would download the app onto any smartphone, Android, Apple, Windows. You would download the app, of course, get online, and you would see the vehicles available in your area. So you'll see them on a map and the proximity and the approximate wait time. On that screen, you also see the rates, and you can plug in your end destination to see a potential fare calculation. Of course, it's a range because you can't account for weather or traffic or whatever it might be sometimes. So you make your selection, and in other markets we have a couple different options, but here we have UberX in Anchorage. So you would request a ride. The closest driver that is available would receive a request on their phone that I mentioned earlier, assuming they, of course, have the option to let it go or accept, but they would accept. They would be given the destination and directions to the rider's destination. Once they get close, it automatically triggers a text message to the rider to let them know that they're just down the block, they're going to be there in a second. So once they, of course, when they're, I should say, clarifying your question too, knowing what car it is, they see a picture of the driver in the lower left-hand corner, and then they also see the make and model, a picture of the make and model, but also listed out the make and model, as well as the license plate, the customer feedback that that driver's previously received in terms of his average rating from riders. So you have a pretty good idea. You have the ability to contact them as well through text or a call. So was that a...
Mr. Browski, anything else?
Oh, no, I think he's still finishing. I'm not done yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they finish the ride, the person hops out, it's a completely cashless transaction. Everything's done through the credit card that you load onto your profile beforehand. And then you would rate the driver, and the driver also rates the rider on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Gives people an opportunity to leave immediate feedback as well if they had any issues, or 99% of the time it's a very positive ride, and feedback is good, but if there are any issues, it gets triggered to us automatically, and we follow up within an hour and a half. So.
And what happens, I'm sorry, I just have a few. What happens if I'm sitting there waiting for 45 minutes and my rider hasn't come, and I just decide I'm going to call Yellow and I'd rather they come and pick me up? How does that work for refunds, or am I still charged for the full fare, or how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I promise it'll never be a 45-minute wait, first of all. But how it works is if for whatever reason there's a miscommunication or something happened where the driver was not able to make it to you, and you had to cancel or whatever it might be, a refund is triggered through a cancellation in our system, and we follow up to ask the rider what happened. Was there anything that was missing, anything we could be doing better? Kind of just get some feedback. And then that's really on an individual case-by-case investigation, because so many things, when that happens, it's usually a one-off thing. So, but definitely something we monitor and look at, and we have a team of customer support representatives dedicated to watching that. So.
Okay, and then my last question, Mr. Chair. There's been some discussion on surge pricing, and the current taxi industry, I don't believe has that ability. Can you talk to me a little bit about surge pricing and just describe how that model works within your system?
Absolutely, it's really it's an algorithm is what it is, that just based on the supply and demand that we currently see on the system, it would adjust prices up or down depending on how busy it is. And so in a newer market like Anchorage that's not on or enabled, that's something that we reserve for the mature markets where we have enough drivers that partner with us that it's reasonable at that point. And usually this is something that is just, it usually doesn't kick in until, say there's a major sporting event in town, or say there's something along those lines where you see demand that's far beyond the norm. That's when it would kick in. And what it does is it's incentivizing more drivers to come onto the system and pick up those increased volume in rides. And make sure that we get riders that really do need a ride, a reliable, safe transportation option that they can rely on in these cases. So,
Okay, my last question, I promise. I know.
I heard that before, Eddie.
The other thing that, we're hearing from the industry who, they've invested a lot of money into some very expensive permits, equipment, and staff. But they're saying, this is unfair because you're coming into this market and you're competing with our market. And, I wonder if that's true. I wonder, what are you seeing? Because you're in some mature markets like New York City. Are you really taking people out of taxi cabs, or are you capturing people that typically aren't taking taxi cabs? I mean, what are you seeing in those markets?
what we've seen when I'll use Seattle again as an example, and it's easier for me to reference, but we've seen the transportation pie grow. I think it's maybe the wrong way to think about it, that you're dicing up a very finite number of trips here. I think it's much more reasonable to understand that with more options and increased access to transportation, you bring more riders onto the system, or maybe not getting behind their car anymore, or the wheel of their car. In those markets, we actually hear from quite a few people that they're starting to use a variety of transportation options and leaving their car at home. They might Uber to a location, and then a cab is right outside, and they end up taking a cab home. Very common, especially on bar break Friday, Saturday nights. That's a very easy option for them. So in these markets, we've seen that really the idea of getting out of your car is growing. People are using multiple forms of transportation because of the choice and the ease of access that this platform brings.
I appreciate it. I'm done for now.
Mr. Steele, and then Mr. Peterson, when we're done, I'll come back to you last.
My question is, at what point is a contract made and who is it made with? Does the potential rider make a contract with you when they're asking with the company when they're asking for a ride? Anyway, at what point are those contracts made, the agreement of the parties?
So it's when you download the app and you're signing up, going through that process is when you would see that piece that you're mentioning.
So there is a contract to provide the ride, so if you don't take the ride, there is no contract, or?
I guess I'm not quite. So
Does the rider have a contract with the driver, or does the rider have a contract with the company?
So it's when you first download the app to have access to the application. That is immediate, I think, is what you're addressing. And I can provide more information and clarity if that's.
Well, but they don't have any liability until they take the ride, is that correct?
In terms of liability.
Well, I mean,
insurance, the
in terms of a
piece.
contract
Okay.
relationship.
We provide the primary insurance on that trip.
No, I'm not talking insurance. I'm talking contracts. I'm
Okay.
talking agreements, and I'm talking then a liability to pay. Is there any agreement between the rider and the driver, or is it all the agreement with the company and
The agreement is with the company to have access to the application. Okay, and if I can provide more clarity potentially.
So there is no liability, I'm using in the contract sense, the legal sense, between the driver and the customer, the person they're transporting.
In terms of them entering into a contract.
Yeah,
It is the access to the in that case.
The driver has an agreement with you,
Yes.
and the rider has an agreement with you,
Yes,
and
we connect them to the platform.
Thank you.
Sorry about that clarity.
Mr. Peterson, then Mr. Holland, we're done. So I've got to move on to taxi cab industry.
You got all
Thanks,
of it.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Back to the surge pricing. I don't know if I understood you correctly or not. Did you say that only in mature markets do you use the surge pricing? So since Anchorage is a new market, you wouldn't be having surge pricing immediately, but eventually, once you got enough drivers, you would have surge pricing? Or?
Yeah, it's something that we monitor, and there are key metrics that we can look at. You talked about how many trips do you, or how many requests do you complete a ride with. That's something we look at. We want to make sure that we have an adequate, option for riders before that something like that is introduced. It really works when there's no church supply on the system.
So are there jurisdictions that are mature that have no surge pricing? Is there an option for no surge pricing?
I'm not familiar with any market that does not do that.
And is the surge pricing an area where there's been problems with customers feeling that they've been gouged in the past?
It's something we do with the surge price when it does go into effect in one of those markets is we have a little window within the app, and I apologize that I can't show you, but it pops up and it shows you exactly the new fares based on, say it's a 1.25 multiplier. It would show the change, the fares that actually change in the app. You'd see the amount in your fare, what it shows for the fare range would change as well. And anytime it would exceed 2.0, you would actually type in 2.0, so you recognize that this isn't a higher fare ride because of increased demand. So.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, I'll
Mr.
be
Hall,
quick. I
last
think-
question.
Yes, I think we were mixing metaphors when you were talking to Mr. Steele. When I download the app, you use the term download the app. When I download the app, what do I have to do to become a member of the Uber app? And there's a contract that is sent to me at that point?
An agreement in app, yes.
Okay.
And then you want me to go through the sign up?
Well, what I'm curious about is what's in there and what do I have to provide you to be able to go to step 2?
Yeah, so it's pretty basic information. It is name, email address, phone number, and then a credit card, of course. And then you would see that agreement piece and be able to access the platform.
And then at that point, when I actually want to use the Uber app, I find a location, I push the button, I tell you I want a driver, and at that point you quote me a price and we've got a contract that you're going to charge me X.
So you would see, we don't know where you're going when you do request. So there's, I guess, no amount, but you can, like I said, kind of get a proposal for the rate of what it might be. Yes, you would see the rates when you're signed into the app.
Okay. That was the piece I misunderstood. I thought when you called and requested a ride, you were at point A and you were wanting to go to point B. You don't have to provide that second piece of it.
No, you have the option to, but it's not required.
Ms. Gray Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really quick question. How do tips work in this scenario?
So with Uber, there's no need to tip on the system. It's not a prohibited thing at all, but it's just not a need given the platform.
So if you want to give a tip, you pay with a credit card for the ride. If you want to tip, then you pay the driver with cash, is what you're saying.
That's something if the rider feels that they would want to do that, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Okay. So tips aren't included in the credit card
No.
transaction. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for being here. We're now going to move to taxis. Dennis,
Thank you for your time.
I want to follow up on that. My understanding is that you provide.
why don't you guys get to the back so I can get the taxi cab?
Well, no, I think you need to hear this information, though, because
Okay,
I
yes.
don't know that what he said is what
Your
answers the
attorney.
question. My understanding is that when you want to tip a driver, you do not pay the driver, you pay through the application. And that application is somehow remitted to the driver. One of the controversies is whether or not the driver should or does receive the full amount of your tip. You don't pay the driver directly there on the spot. You don't hand the driver. You're not supposed to hand the driver a $10 bill. So maybe he could clarify his answer.
So I can clarify how it works. So so say you have a $10 fare. On every fare, there's a 20% fee that goes to Uber, so $2 would go to Uber, $8 would go to the driver in that situation. There's no separate tipping function, which is, I think, where there may be a disconnect within the app.
Thank you. Let me get the taxi people up here. Who's going to represent the taxi industry? Billable hours, huh?
That's right, Mr. Trainee.
Welcome to the meeting. Identify yourself for the record.
Thanks, sir. I'm Jim Brennan. I'm an attorney for the Anchorage Taxi Cab Permit Owners Association, otherwise known as ATCOA, and also both of the dispatch companies in town, Alaska with Dispatch and Checker. I didn't realize till just now we were going to get an opportunity to speak, so forgive me if I'm a little
Well, if you don't want the
disorganized here.
opportunity,
I'll take it. Thanks, Dave. Let me just address a question that was raised by some of you already, having to do with the contract with Uber. When you sign on as a customer, first thing that comes up is terms and conditions you have to agree to. And part of those say the company does not provide transportation services and the company is not a transportation carrier. It's up to the third-party transportation provider, driver, or vehicle to offer transportation services, etc. Then it goes on to say, disclaimer of warranties. Company makes no representation, warranty, or guarantee as to the reliability, timeliness, quality, suitability, availability, accuracy, or completeness of the service. Then when it comes to the driver, it says the company makes no representation, warranty, or guarantee as to the reliability, safety, timeliness, quality, suitability, or availability of any services obtained by third parties. Then there's a limitation of liability. In no event will the company and its licensors be liable to anyone for any indirect, punitive, special, exemplary, incidental, consequential, or other damages of any type or kind, including personal injury, etc. Basically, what Uber is saying to customers is, you got a problem, take it up with the personal driver who has showed up to, we're not really a transportation company. Well, of course, that's malarkey. They are a transportation company. To say they are a technology services, what is it, technology network company? They set up this system and recruit individual drivers to participate. They collect the money for the service. You send a credit card to Uber. In response to some of the arguments that have been raised around the country, they now say, oh, we Uber do check, we do vehicle inspections, we do background checks. If they were just a transportation network company, would they be doing that? No, they are in the same business that taxi cabs are. I want to just look at the definition in the bill, the ordinance. This is 2014-127. I understand there's now been just in the last few minutes, a substitute. We haven't seen it yet. So I'll just look at the one that's been filed. It says, transportation network companies, TNCs, are companies that use websites or smartphone applications to connect passengers with drivers. And the drivers use personal vehicles for commercial services. Okay, what's the difference between that and a regulated taxi cab? On the first part, companies that use websites or smartphone applications to connect passengers with drivers, both of your Anchorage taxi cab dispatch companies are doing that right now. They both have smartphone app systems that do exactly the same thing that Uber's system does. So what's left? Why wouldn't we not consider Alaska Yellow Cab or Checker Cab to be TNCs, transportation network companies, covered by this bill, which basically throws out Title 11? The only difference is that a TNC, the drivers use personal vehicles for commercial services. Now, isn't this a little backwards? That because instead of a regulated, inspected taxi cab containing required markings and required equipment, we allow personal vehicles to be used, that instead of providing more stringent regulations, we completely let them off the hook and provide no regulations whatever. They're performing the same services. Both of them also have an electronic app, but one of them is subject to 5 decades worth of expensive and extensive regulations, while the other is going to be let off scot-free, except for what? An MOU that we haven't seen yet, that we're going to use as a model. What? The city of Detroit? Are you kidding? Anchorage is going to look to the city of Detroit for guidance on how to set up a municipal regulatory system? I mean, this is a city that's in receivership. It's bankrupt. They haven't shown an ability to provide guidance to Anchorage or anyone else on how to run a railroad or a taxi system. And these are taxi cabs that Uber is using. They take the same service. The passenger calls, customer calls, wants a ride from here, specific point of departure, to their destination. You're going to pay based upon some kind of time and mileage arrangement. What's the difference? Why is that not a taxi cab? The only difference they can tout is, well, we're using 21st century technology. So is the Anchorage taxi cab industry. Is that a reason to throw out extensive Title 11 that has been in place since 1976 on unification, and actually was in place before then. No, it isn't. You can go down the line of comparing, what Uber does compared to what Anchorage cabs do, and the regulations they're subject to. I don't know if you've seen these. These were, I think, provided to you. ATOA prepared these. One of them compares, similar to what the city just gave you, but I think this is a little more to the point in some cases. Comparison of the insurance situation between the two, and the comparison of the responsibilities undertaken by the two. One under an Anchorage code, and the other under their own internal, don't worry about it, we Uber will guard the in-house. If you look at the insurance situation, first of all, I've already discussed the fact that Uber starts with a waiver of liability at the outset that the customer has to agree to. And then when it comes to this insurance coverage, as has been pointed out, and the Alaska Division of Insurance has already said, there is no coverage in a personal auto policy that these participants have for commercial activity. There's an exclusion. You look at your own auto policy, I know who the heck reads those, but if you look at the fine print, which is what counts, there is an exclusion for commercial activity. Sometimes it's worded in terms of for-profit activity. So you don't have coverage under the driver's personal policy. Now Uber says, don't worry about it, we've got coverage. But just like the presentation you heard today, you have to delve into the devil is in the details on insurance coverage. And believe me, when it comes to defending against having to pay against a personal injury claim, insurance companies read the fine print and rely upon it. And in the case, for example, in San Francisco, where the 6-year-old girl was killed because an Uber driver ran over her at an intersection while he was looking for his fare, he already had turned the app on. Uber said, we're not liable. He wasn't under our policy then. And after a year's worth of political wrangling, Uber finally was drawn kicking and screaming to legislation that exists only in California and nowhere else, and won't go into effect even in California until next year, which for the first time would require Uber to be primarily insurance required coverage for the situation where the driver's turned the app on, but before it's picked up the customer. We ask, well, what liability can occur there? Well, lots of liability. Just as occurred in San Francisco, where in looking for where is my fare, he runs over someone. In the Anchorage taxi cab, there's required minimal coverages, which this assembly has imposed, which are effective whenever that taxi cab and wherever that taxi cab is operating. It can be parked in the driveway and it's covered. Also, the required coverages in Anchorage include uninsured motorist and underinsured motorist coverage. Uber doesn't purport to cover that. In fact, Uber, as I was mentioning earlier, if there is no primary coverage because the driver is not covered, there is a big litigatable issue as to whether Uber's excess coverage even kicks in. I don't know if any of you have had familiarity with like umbrella or excess coverage, but it's ordinarily a requirement that you have the primary coverage up to certain limits in effect. And if you've got nothing but a personal auto policy, that doesn't trigger the
Mr.
excess.
Brennan, I hate to interrupt you, but could
Sure.
you wind up? I've got to have some time for some member questions.
Yes.
We're running out of time.
Yeah. Let me just see. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is their safety features. This assembly spent a lot of time this last year adding a bunch of regulation to Title 11, and I know you haven't forgotten that. That's the last time I appeared before you. And one of the things you added was an additional requirement that there be video surveillance cameras. There's already requirements that there's supposed to be a silent alarm system, two-way radio system. None of those are featured in the Uber cars. Why do we have those things? Just for the heck of it, just to impose an unnecessary burden on taxi cabs? No, it's for the protection of the drivers and the passengers. I'll stop there.
Thank you, sir. Question from assembly members. Mr. Hall, Mr. Steele.
Yes, I'd like to have a copy of that, of the contract that you read. I'd also like to see, Chairman, a copy of of the contract the drivers have to agree to as well. And then it would be nice to see the insurance policy, but the devil is in the detail, and it is in the fine print, and we need to understand whatever it is we're going to be doing.
Mr. Evans, sir.
May I respond to that briefly, Mr. Chairman?
Quickly, sir,
On the
yes.
insurance, yes, you absolutely should demand to see the insurance policy. And we have not been able to get it. It's not generally available. Everything with Uber is close to the vest. California discovered that they had to just completely go after them in order to get that type of information.
Mr. Evans, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. As we heard, Uber operates in 200 and some cities. Is the position of the taxi industry that Uber should not be operating in Anchorage under its current method of operation, but instead should be actually the same as taxi cabs, colored, dispatch, meters, the whole thing?
Our position is that Uber, they are welcome to operate in Anchorage if they play by the same rules as other transportation companies that do the same, provide the same services do. I mean, the concept of a level playing field is pretty well ingrained in our society and in our constitutions. And in the state constitution, there's, as you know, Mr. Evans, there's an equal protection clause that requires that similarly situated parties be treated in the same way. And if there's going to be any difference between the two, there's got to be a fair and substantial relationship between that difference and the purpose of the code. Now here the code's purpose is safety and consumer protection. And in terms of the differences, there are no real differences, except that the only difference is that Uber doesn't serve everybody as taxi cabs are required to do. They only serve credit card customers and people with a smartphone app. A taxi cab doesn't have the luxury of limiting its service to those people. It has to serve everybody.
Are you indicating that you would require Uber to have taxi cab permits?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Evans. Ms. Dombrowski.
I always have something. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've made I've never hidden the fact that I felt Title 11 was deficient last year. It's still failing to serve Girdwood, Chudiak, Eagle River, Birchwood, Peters Creek. The fact is times are changing. That's a fact. And the fact is my community, Girdwood, they're not getting the same levels of service. And so rather than, I had a very candid conversation with some permit owners and some dispatch companies. And, this obstructionist mentality of just keep them out, I don't want to see that. I want this to become a constructive process. And I want to see how we can make this work. And does that mean maybe dispatch companies are now going to be TNCs? Maybe. Does that mean we have to change Title 11 to, this isn't 1976 anymore. It's not unification. It's time for us to really look at this and say, maybe the best way to deal with this, Mr. Brennan, is through creative solutions, competition, and technology. But I want to go back to one comment you made when you were talking about, you briefly alluded to responsibility and are you aware of, my understanding is if Uber has a driver that is maybe not delivering a really good product, maybe they've gotten bad reviews or anything, they cut them off, they basically terminate them. Do you have any information on how Uber operates in this manner?
Well, I have some information, but there's no uniformity since it's not a regulated, they've managed to escape regulation in many cities. I do know that Uber drivers have been found belatedly to have criminal records, including for sexual assault, burglary, and whatnot, and nevertheless are have been permitted to operate. So this idea that let's rely on Uber to regulate itself, I think that
let
washes.
me just follow up on that line of thinking. Have we not had taxi cab drivers that have been convicted of sexual assault and in fact raped people?
We had one that was alleged to have, and that was one of the things I was hearing last time, by the way.
So
that-
both systems are
that
not
Well,
perfect.
wait a minute, that gentleman was acquitted in the criminal trial. But if there was a problem, much lesser problem than that, they lose their chauffeur's license. And the permit owner is in danger of revocation of an expensive permit. Now, that's a very strong incentive to keep from hiring people like that. Whereas with Uber, that person has nothing great invested in it. There's no permit owner behind them that's really invested in the thing. So there's a whole lot less incentive for that to comply with the law and have a clean background.
Last question, I promise.
Thank you, ma'am.
So you mentioned chauffeur's license. So would the industry, I'll just call it that for simplicity's sake, would they be more receptive to Uber, the potential of allowing this new type of endeavor if the drivers had to have chauffeur licenses?
I understand your question, and I think this is one of those things where it's pretty hard to be half pregnant. You're either playing by the rules or you're not. Can you imagine being?
I was trying not to laugh at that analogy. I'm sorry.
Well, can you imagine
Caught me
being?
off guard.
Can you
It's only
imagine?
female,
Can you imagine being in an industry where you were subject to all sorts of regulation and expensive fees, and suddenly the government came along and said, well, because somebody's got some hotshot electronic system, by the way, which you yourself then get, that they are not required to comply with those regulations and fees, but you are required to compete with them.
Well, that's why I was saying, why not break it open?
I understand your position. You think that the whole system should be thrown out.
No, that's not what I said.
Thank you,
Oh, I
ma'am.
thought that's what you said.
That's not what I said.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Any other questions from assembly members? Tim, one last?
No, I'm done.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Where we're going from here is we've got a committee we're putting together. Mr. Evans is heading it up. Amy, you're on it. Ernie's on it. I'm on it. We may add a few more semi-members as time dictates. Now, I do have this wonderful manual. I appreciate what Mr. Weirdo gave us. That's a small one compared to this thing. We have copies built for everybody on the committee, thanks to our attorney. She went to a meeting where the question was this type of technology. So what you might want to do is read it before Mr. Evans has the next meeting. Now on Tuesday night, this is coming in front of us. I intend to take public testimony and then probably delay it for a while. Because I think what we want to do is have a more complete ordinance coming forward that addresses all the concerns. But I think this will give us a good primer on where we need to go. Okay? This meeting's now over.